You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare, hosted by Mick Cook.
Have you ever sat in a headquarters and wondered whether or not you needed to go to the gym because you'd just been lifting the orders sent to you by your higher headquarters, or actually it might have even been the document you produced, thinking you were doing the best you could? Have you ever been in a conflict zone and knew what to do but had to wait 2 months to get permission to do it? How does that work? How do you get orders late? And whose job is it to tell you what to do? G'day ladies and gents, welcome back to the Dead Prussian podcast for 2024. I'm your host Mick, the humblest host there is of a podcast named after a 19th century Prussian military theorist. Now ladies and gents, today's topic is one that is very close to my heart because it's very close to my frustrations I've had from times when I was serving. We're talking about command, land command in the 21st century. Now, for those of us that went through the Long War or the PowerPoint Wars, as some have talked about it, can relate to the idea of getting your orders maybe a couple of months after you've already gone on the operation, or, as I've experienced before, doing up orders after an operation to explain what you did. But why does it happen, and is it the right approach? Is there anything in military theory that can help us push towards a more streamlined version? What happens in a major conflict like what we're seeing in Ukraine? What happens in world wars? Well, I actually don't know, because as I've told you before, listeners, I don't have the answers. But I like to get guests on here that have some answers for us. My guest today is Jim Storr. He is a former infantry officer who served in the British Army for 25 years and has a PhD in military theory. Jim has taught at military staff colleges and taught at Oxford University and is the author of several books, including Something Rotten, Land Command in the 21st Century. Jim, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you. Good morning, or is it good afternoon?
It's good midnight here, I think. Now, Jim, personal connection. We've had a few soldier scholars on the show before, and it's really interesting to find out what made them move from doing to researching and educating, I suppose. So what motivated you to become a scholar and research military command structures?
Well, the first thing to say, I'm not sure I am a scholar. I consider myself to be a defence analyst, but to answer your question, I was a major, just about to come up to lieutenant colonel. I was beginning to think about a second career. I had a conversation with the then newly appointed Professor Richard Holmes, the late Richard Holmes, and he was basically looking for PhD candidates. So I signed up. I then went through 5 years of purgatory because I was doing what became the British Army's first in-service PhD in the humanities. It's not actually about command structures. It's about the nature of military thought. Turned into my first book. PhD completed in 2002, left the Army in 2006, and here we are.
Excellent. And one of your first, might have even been your first book, about the human element of warfare. That was a book I know that was pushed upon several of us in Townsville a few years ago, and that's the book that I think came out of your PhD studies. Is that correct?
Well, funnily enough, here's one I happened to have earlier. Yep, that's the one. Human Face of War came out in 2009, but in simple terms, no one ever wants to read a PhD. The trick to do, first of all, is to find a publisher, but secondly, to turn what you have, which no one would want to read, into a book that people might want to read, and at the risk of publicising my own work too blatantly, it's still selling quite nicely. So that's 15, 16 years after the event, so that's good to see.
It's great to see it still selling. I managed to bail you up for a signed copy a while ago, and I remember throwing it at my captains quite a lot. So there's a few tabs and a few divots in my copy actually from being in the field. So I was pretty excited when I got a hold of your book, Something Rotten, Land Command in the 21st Century, which is your third book I've read. Your second book is King Arthur's Wars, which I know is being pushed out there again after being successful the first printing. So I'm keen to get you back on the show for that one. But I want to talk about Something Rotten, Land Command, because it it's for me, it's about closure, about my frustrations all those years ago when I was a young captain. So in this book, you critically assess the command structures and practices in Western armed forces and primarily land forces. Can you elaborate on how these structures have evolved over the past few decades, and what ways do you believe they are falling short?
The first part of your question is how they evolved, and the real answer there is largely incrementally. There's rarely been a point where you can say they rapidly got bigger there or then. There have been a couple of steps, but not big ones. But if you go and delve into the establishment tables for those headquarters, you can look at, in simple terms, from 1945 to, say, 1990, there's a very, very slow enlargement. They don't get much bigger at all. And then, and it's partly to do with the wars of choice, it's partly to do with the shift to coin and peace support operations and so on. They got bigger much more quickly, but again, there's no single big step change. Oh, we need a couple of guys to do this. Oh, we need someone else to do that, and so on. So the first thing to say there, it's mostly been bad. In other words, people haven't really been keeping an eye on it. It just sort of happened. But then the second one, which I think is important and gets into the structure more, is an excessive focus on planning. So we now get to the point where we have an awful lot of people in a headquarters wrapped up doing nothing other than planning. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of people. The more people you have, the amount of time goes up, probably with something like the square of the number of people involved, and so on and so forth. Now, in what ways do I believe that they're falling short? Well, at the beginning of the book, it describes that I went through a question of asking fairly senior officers 3 simple questions. Those questions were: do you believe that our headquarters are currently too big? Do you believe that the orders that they produce are too long? Do you believe that it takes too long to produce those orders? Now, I asked about 3 dozen officers, lieutenant colonel up to full general, that over a period of about 8 or 9 years, and they all agreed. So I then started researching for something rotten, and I asked probably another 3 dozen officers of the same sort of rank range, and they all agreed. And since I've published the book, I've now been on lectures, seminars. I do some teaching at our intermediate staff course and so on. And every time I ask an audience that and I ask them to put their hands up, you get about 80-85% of the people in the room agreeing. Well, that tells us there's a problem. And it tells us that there's an awareness that there's a problem. So in a sense, the stuff in Something Rotten is pushing against an open door.
It's interesting the way that people are admitting to it right within the system. People who arguably would have responsibility for changing a system as well. I do remember sitting through a planning exercise for a humanitarian disaster relief operation, and it was just an exercise for a full week. We had 40 planners there from around the country. And during the week, an actual cyclone hit a regional neighbour, and disaster relief operation was required. But to actually get that done, what we did was we sent everyone home, and 4 of the core planning team, we sat and planned it over the weekend, which for me was something that just didn't resonate with this plan that we'd come up with. Because the plan that we came up with, that we operationalised, it was a small amount of paper compared to the one that would spend a week planning. And so that's one of the experiences for me, that when I went through reading Something Rotten, it just touched that idea of planning, a lot of planning, right? And so your book advocates for significant change in how staff officers approach writing, planning, and prioritising clarity and output over processes. Could you discuss a few instances, or historical examples are always welcome on this show. We are called the Dead Prussian, where you believe a simplified output-orientated approach would have changed or altered the outcome, or at least, without looking back at doing hypotheticals, but how it could assist in military operations and decision-making processes.
Yeah, I can. I think the easy short answer to that is just look at the people who lost. The best example that you can come up with is the French army in the fall of France in 1940. They're taking too long. They have a method which will produce them a moderately standardized order the following day. Fine. What happens when the Germans attack now? There's a really good book, you may well be aware of it. It's Karl-Heinz Prussia, who a former German general staff officer, who forensically analysed the operation orders and the timings that they were released, the timings that the operations then took place, how long was it, how do you compare between French and German, and what you find is the Germans are doing something which will work, but they're doing it in a fraction of the time. And the really important thing that, to my mind, that comes out of it is that time and time again, the Germans just preempt the French. Sometimes by only 5 minutes, sometimes by an hour, but they do. And they're there before the French arrive. And it preempts the French time and time again. And I think that's a very good example. The next two examples, well, in fact, you could say anything up to 3 or 4 examples, depending on how you define them, are the Arab-Israeli wars. In simple round terms, the Israelis thought and acted materially faster than the Egyptians or the Jordanians or the Syrians or whoever. To be fair, the Jordanians were better than most. But again, it's because, by and large, the Arab armies had a big, deliberate planning system, and the Israelis could think and act faster. So a lot of it comes down to thinking and acting, but that is done, as you know well, by command posts who have a planning process and are in an organization which has a structure and all those kind of things. And that's really why I dwelt on, first of all, what's this for? What's the purpose? But then the structures, the processes, and the products that they deliver. So that's that. There are more recent ones. I think quite an intriguing one, actually. If you go to Operation Desert Storm and you look at the US 7 Corps, now, the first thing to say is I'm not criticizing the Americans for being American. It was a blindingly good operation. It was the first operation that anyone had done on that scale for decades, and it was highly successful, but could it have been done better? In round terms, the Iraqi Republican Guard Forces Command got away. When you start to unpick that, the main effort, the American main effort, was with the 7th Corps, which comprised 5 divisions and an armoured cavalry regiment, in other words, another separate brigade. The plan was very highly synchronized, highly coordinated. We'll do that, and then they do that, and then they do that, and then they do that, and that happens to that. And in round terms, it was in lockstep. And there has been considerable criticism in various places that if it had been less deliberate, less synchronized, more just get on and do it, but more to the point, if there had been 2 smaller corps formed out the same resources, actually the whole thing would have been more flexible, and arguably the particular outcome is that really the RGFC would never have got away. So I think there's lots of issues in there. It's not all necessarily about structure. It's not necessarily all about process, product, and plan. There's lots of things in there. But I think there are several good examples.
And you touched on a few key terms there, which for listeners that haven't yet bought Something Rotten, and they definitely will straight after they listen to this. And I'll put the link in the show notes, ladies and gents. Get it from if you get it from Amazon, the link I provide. The show will get a hat tip from Amazon as well, which helps me keep the lights on. But in the book, Jim has structured it with purpose, products, process, structure, systems, people, mission, command, and then observations and conclusions. So it's an easy way to follow it for people that are very invested in it. Right, this is a great book for staff officers and more importantly for commanders, I think, in how they look to set up their decision making support mechanisms. And so if we look towards the future and we look at the long wars, the forever wars, the wars of choice we've had, a lot of those wars have been fought with multinational task forces. In fact, my experience as a operational officer was I was an artillery officer embedded in a Scottish battalion in the British forces in Helmand Province. So, that's very far from home. And when people talk about, united or divided by the same language, there was a few cultural things. The best thing about the UK, though, is every little village has a different regional accent. So at least the accent wasn't a problem when I went over there, because everyone had an accent. And when you're a country kid from Tasmania in Australia working in a Glaswegian regiment, you learn to deal with accents pretty quickly, to be honest. But it kind of points towards where a lot of our future military commanders will have grown up, and I'm talking about our future generals. A lot of our current generals went through this as well. They're in multinational organisations. They're adopting the cultures of usually the predominant partner, and quite often that's the United States. So what are the key steps military organisations should take to transition from current state to more effective and efficient structures?
The first step is to recognise the problem. As I say, I've spoken to a lot of people going back at least to 2019, but in fact long before that. And by and large, I'm pushing against an open door, and without giving away any confidences, but I was talking to a 2-star earlier this week, and he told me that practically everybody that he spoke to, and you can imagine that goes quite a long way up from there, in NATO, recognises that there is an issue here. So that's a really good thing. The second thing, this might sound strange, but I think the thing that people ought to do straight away is just change the way that we do command post exercises. It's something which armies identified roughly in the Edwardian period, so the first decade of the 19th century. Every exercise to be two-sided, free play, and in real time. And if you did that, you'd suddenly recognise that what we're doing at the moment, which is usually very, very measured in its speed, you'd suddenly find that the slower command process almost invariably failed for the very simple reason, and the only reason, is that it was slow. Mm-hmm. In other words, that would reinforce the issue for the fact that we have to do something. Now, in my experience, most commanders really are not stupid. I mean, we can joke about that, but I just don't find stupid commanders. What they sometimes can't really grasp is that there is a problem. But once they realize there's a problem, not being stupid, they do something about it. And I think you would find people beginning to say, hey, we need to do this faster. And I have already seen very good evidence, some of it Australian, some of it British, that headquarters are trying to slim down and speed up their processes and probably produce smaller orders. That's less of a thing, but they are aware that they need to do things faster. But there is a problem there, and the specifics depend on whose army you're in or which nation you're in or whatever. But I think practically every army has some kind of certification process by which a unit or a formation is certified as being fit for operations. Now, the problem is, if that process is largely a tick box methodology in itself, then what they're looking for is adherence to explicit process. Now, a lot of the problem comes from the fact that our armies have written more and more and more process. So the certification authorities, whoever they are, then go and tick those things. Now, here's a good example, and I can talk from having spoken to both a brigade commander and a divisional commander in the last couple of months. If you know that you need to be certified for operations, in our case also then for NATO operations, and you've got to go through those processes, and those sign you off with only, say, a month or two to go before you take up your responsibilities, would you then say, okay, boys and girls, we've now done it the official way, we're now going to throw that out and learn to do it faster? Or are you actually going to tend to say, well, let's see if we can make it a little bit faster here and cut that down there? In other words, certification, if done wrongly, is a barrier to changing things. I think that's a problem. If you change the certification process, I think a lot of people would naturally work out how they could do things faster. and we can explore some of those things. But the next thing in there is to go back to the process. I have two documents. One's an e-document, which is the current British, Planning and Execution Handbook, which I think is 214 pages. And the key section is, I think, 74 pages with 77 explicit steps. And over there, just on my shelf over there, I can get it and show it to you, is the 1944 equivalent, which is a little A6 thing, or that sort of size. And the relevant package is 2.5 pages long. Now, the 1946 or 1949 copy stands on 6 years of the Second World War. And by the way, it's common to your army and my army. But that then stands on 4 years of the First World War, because of course, the generals of the Second World War were the captains of the First World War. So those guys who, if you take Montgomery as a case in point, a young captain, acting lieutenant colonel, chief of staff of a division in the First World War, he's the sort of guy who signed off that thing after the 1948, 49, whenever it is, as being fit for role. So these guys thought that was all you needed, standing on their hard experience. So the amount of process has gone up dramatically. We're now certifying, in many cases, people as fit for operations on those processes. And I think that's stopping formation commanders. I say they're not stupid. They're able and well-intentioned people from saying, you know what, we're going to throw that a lot of that away and reduce it down to the basics and produce things which are a lot smaller. If I can just throw in one little line that you might like. I did recently hear a formation commander saying, thank you for the operation order. Can you now please take it out and weigh it? And the expectation it would come in a couple of lever-arch files and it would weigh a couple of kilograms.
Which is good for staff officers to keep their fitness, but maybe not their mental fitness. And everyone who's served especially in the past couple of decades, knows there are annexes that someone puts their hard intellectual sweat into that no one will read.
Absolutely.
And my best result was when I wrote my particular section of an operations order and then sent it up to the higher headquarters for just to make sure that I wasn't going crazy in what I was asking for. And it actually came back signed as an order for me to execute, which wasn't what I was looking to do, but it must have been pretty good. So I was quite happy with that one, because it was a cut and paste approach to doing things. And these sorts of things happen when, I guess, we're experienced in wars of choice and the corporatisation of wars that you are fighting because you want to fight them, as opposed to what we're seeing in some other parts of the world right now of wars that you are fighting because you have to. Now, Jim, we have advertising-supported content and we also have premium subscribers. Now, advertising-supported content are the people who are cheap and they get to listen to ads while we have a conversation with our premium subscribers. So I'll just take a quick pause. And now that we're back with everyone, those who are not premium subscribers, definitely consider it just for that answer. Not only was Jim's answer brilliant, I also came up with a very humorous idea on how to fix the command issues of NATO. Now, Jim, we're coming up to the final stages of the podcast, and this is time to pay the butcher's bill, to do what Big Carl did several times in his book, even though everyone only focuses on the one bit in the first chapter. We're trying to define war. That's what this show's about, is to encourage people to talk about war and engage with understanding it as best they can. The way we do this is we ask every guest to finish the same sentence as the final question for them on the show, and that sentence is war is. So, Jim, I ask you, can you please finish the sentence war is?
Well, thank you for that. I go back to the book that I picked up earlier, and that's why I had it on my desk. In order to finish your sentence directly, I would just say war is human. But what I'd like to do, if I may, and for those of you who have a copy to hand, it's page 56 of Human Face of War. War is basically an interaction between human organisation. It's adversarial, highly dynamic, complex, and lethal. It is grounded in individual and collective human behaviour and fought between organisations that are themselves complex. Technology has a large part to play. War is not determined, hence uncertain and evolutionary. But critically, and to an extent which we currently overlook, war is fundamentally a human activity.
Excellent. That's an excellent definition. I don't think we've had it on the show phrased that way. That is to say, no former guest has read directly from your book on the show. I do know that our premium subscribers have heard that before when I did a book review of The Human Face of War a few years ago now. So, in fact, I'd be surprised if any of them remember it or if they're even still the same premium subscribers. Jim, thank you very much for coming on the show. I have enjoyed this very much. I read your books, so I enjoy your books quite a bit. And listeners, I think you benefited from another interview with a guest that has trod both lines in terms of been there and walked in the uniform, and then also applied academic rigour to some of the problems and challenges we find out there for our serving colleagues. So, Jim, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, you can find Jim's book at all good bookstores, is what I'm supposed to say, but I actually want you to just find it at the link in our show notes, because if you do that, Jim's publisher gets paid, Jim probably collects a royalty check, and then Amazon shells out some money towards the show as well. So we don't take it from Jim, we don't take it from his publisher, we steal it from Amazon. Well, they give it to us, but you can think of it as stealing from it. When you see, Jeff Bezos's latest car or space rocket, just think every time you buy a book through our links, you're taking a little bit of money away from his next toy. So get on there, buy the book. Also buy The Human Face of War. You won't regret it. It's one of my favourite military theory books. And also buy King Arthur's Wars. It is a masterclass in understanding terrain and warfare, and it is something that after I hit stop recording, I'm going to then try and badger Jim into coming back on the show to talk about that one, because I think that's something that is something our listeners will definitely benefit from, but you won't understand how you benefit from it until we actually do a discussion on it. So it's one that I've held off doing a book review for our premium subscribers, because I really want to do an interview on that one as well. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Follow the Dead Prussian podcast on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod and Facebook at facebook.com/thedeadprussian. The Dead Prussian podcast is hosted and produced by Mick Cook. The Dead Prussian podcast is copyright of Mick Cook.